On the Isle of Norg-Tzel, time did not pass. It steeped like tea in the black waters of the marshlands, and for centuries its immortal monarch, the Lich Queen Nasa Karasa, was the embodiment of this stillness. She was a creature of the Ghost Hist faith, a belief that embraces the final, quiet truth of decay. And her ambition was not to conquer lands, but to master the secrets of life and death within her isolated domain. She was a tyrant, a monster, a necromancer. But she was a dormant one, content in her tribal huts and her endless arcane experiments within the Monastery of Madness. And in her laboratory, she would carefully conduct her work and forever be absorbed in it for a time immemorial. And her reign was long and absolute, but her vision was confined to the shores of her island, and the world beyond was a distraction. The old ways were enough, and her people would live in rustic squalor, hunts, and tents, and she and her cold glory, both accepted as the natural order. The white scale brought death, yes, but it was a quiet, patient death, and the death of endings, not of violent new beginnings, along with the eternal cycle of rebirth. But then, one night, a dream came, and a vision that was so powerful, it would fracture the foundations of the Queen's ancient soul, and she saw her own land, but not as it was. It was Norg-Tzel of intenseness, a reality where a kingdom that lived and breathed with the power she had never conceived of. Here is a small excerpt from Nasa. My Norg-Tzel's of dream is more than my Norg-Tzel of waking, and I feel more alive when asleep than awake. And in that moment, her centuries of contentment shattered, and she saw the old ways for what they were, not sacred tradition, but shackles. And this poor man's peace of her people was not harmony, but stagnation. And this dream was a message, a divine command from the void itself. And a new terrible purpose would bloom in the wasteland of her heart, and she would not merely preside over her people, but she would free them. And as if in the answer to this newfound purpose, the dream offered a tool, and it is an artifact from the Daedric Prince of Nightmares, Vermina, the skull of corruption. Before, such a thing may have been a mere curiosity for Nasa, but now it was the first step, the first weapon of her new crusade. Her ambition, dormant for the ages, was roaring with life and fueled by a zealous, messianic, deathly flame. And she would drag her people, kicking and thralling, into the new age. Nasa would awaken from this dream and seize the skull without hesitation, and the dream would shatter like glass. And as her eyes would open, those pale white eyes with a feverish aggressive light, she would rise like a predator from the times before she became a lich. She was a different creature now. The Lich Queen was a revolutionary, and the Guardians of Tradition was now its executioner. She would follow the Ghost Hist forever, but her interpretation of its tenets would be warped into something new and violent. And the change begins now. Nasa later strides over into her throne room, ignoring all passerbys, and she would go straight to the maps. She would stare at her gaze, no longer one of passive irritation, but of active strategic hunger. And she would assess everything. Her lands, her people, for now they are not just raw materials for her grand design, but pieces and tools for her to utilize. And her first act would be not one of magic or terror, but of pragmatism and development. She needed to build and fortify her island. And to do that, she would need better tools and better servants. And the days of quiet experimentation were over, and the age of aggressive expansion of the soul and the very nature of her people would begin. And all those who stood in the way would be broken, enthralled, and slayed away into the swamp. And a purpose would awaken in the deathless mind of Nasa Karasa, and her epiphany did not merely give her ambition, it infected her with a terrifying restless urgency. And the centuries of her patience were scoured away and replaced by a new form of zealotry. And as she surveyed her island domain, she did not see the old ways that the Hist faith revered, but instead she sharpened her gaze and saw only inefficiencies and decay. And it would be an insult to the glorious vision she now nurtured. Why? Why waste away in the huts and wait for the inevitable end? Change is the one thing that will always come. We must not regress ourselves back into the old ways and the old habits, thinking that flinging mud is an acceptance of the things in death that is to come. No. For in this cycle, it should be a cycle of growth and constant accession. And the winding, muddy paths between settlements was not quaint, but obstacles to supply. And the scattered independent huts were not a symbol of individualism, but a chaotic mess that defied central planning. And the very faith that had sustained her once before was now seen as a gilded cage of complacency. And she, its queen, would become its most ruthless reformer. And of course, as she now sees along in her map, she would move and trace along new infrastructure within her throne room. And her first obstacle was her own court. They were creatures of tradition and sycophants, and warriors suited for tribal skirmishes, but not for the grand work of nation building. And to enact her great vision for Norg-Tzel, she required a master administrator and a mind that could see logics and supply lines with the same clarity as she would see the flow of magicka. Her agents were dispatched, and their orders were very simple. Find the most skilled steward in the surrounding territories and bring them to me. And of course, the reports would flow in, naming candidates who were dismissed with the flick of Nasa's claw. One was too pious, another too greedy, a third too ambitious, another just not good enough. The queen was not seeking a partner, but a high-functioning tool, and it must be perfect. And finally, days passed, and she was able to find a report detailing a man of minor lineage with an almost supernatural gift for organization, a man whose work had tripled the output of his village's meager farmland. And his name was fetched and his location noted. Yes, indeed, he was the one with such high skill. And the chosen Argonian would be bragged along into the throne room. He was not a renowned warrior, and his terror is plain. And little did you know that Argonians would sweat despite the chamber's chill, and his eyes would dart nervously through all the decorations, of course, the floating heads and the skulls, the unsettling trophies that belonged to the Queen's long reign in her experiments. He would prostrate himself before the Queen, his face pressed against the floor, and Nasa would speak. "Rise. Let me see the tool my agents have brought me." And of course he would rise slowly, forcing himself to look at the Queen, and her glowing eyes would peer right through him, analyzing him, looking into the depths of his soul and assess his worth. He felt less like a lizard man and more like an animal being inspected at the market. "Your village chief sings your praises, and he speaks of yields that defy the norms of our people. And he speaks of a mind that thinks in numbers and lines and not in superstitions and traditions. And these are skills that I long need in my court. My kingdom, Norg-Tzel, is entering a new age, and we are shedding away the rot of stagnation. And this work requires a skilled hand to manage its foundation, and that hand will be yours." Your Majesty, I am a humble servant of my chief. I am not worthy of a place at your court. Your worthiness is not for you to decide. It is a fact, and I have acknowledged it. You will not merely be a member of my court, and your talents are too valuable to risk losing, and you will be bound to me and to my vision, and you will be my consort. And of course, the Argonian's face grows greatly pale. It was the worst situation you could imagine, not a summon for service, but servitude of the most intimate kind. And he would open his mouth and no words would be able to be uttered, because this offer was an order and also a death sentence if refused. The request for his hand was sent to his chief, a cruel, ironic, humiliating joke, a formality that offered the illusion of choice where none existed, and to deny the White Queen was to have his entire village become a new source for her experiments. And he knew this, his chief knew this, that he was a sacrifice offered up to appease a terrifying god. And he would give a short, jerky nod, sealing his fate. And the wedding that followed was a cold, functional necessity. There would be no feast or songs, but a political ritual performed with the emotional warmth of vivisections. Presiding over the ceremony was the Queen's long-suffering ghost speaker, Andar, his faith rooted in the sanctity of the Hist, in the truth of the cycle of life and death, and in the traditions that gave it meaning. This was indeed a mockery. And as Andar would stand before the throne presiding over the ceremony, he would recite the ancient vows, but his voice would be hollow. And he would look at his queen, a being he would once revere as a guardian, and see as a zealot was now a heretic in his eyes. He would look at the groom, a man radiating pure terror, and see a victim. And Andar's hands would tremble slightly as he performed the rites, his heart aching with a dissent he would never dare to voice. He would remember the younger Nasa, a queen, while fearsome, still led the rites with respect, who understood that the swamp gave and the swamp would take, and it was their place to honor that cycle and not break it upon the wheel of progress. And now she stood before him, binding a terrified man to her in a loveless pact, all in the service of an ambition that would feel alien and profane. And also, you would never forget about the rumors of her connections to Vermina, the Daedric Prince. And now she stood, indeed. His disapproval was a heavy cloak he wore under his robes, a silent and suffocating grief. And yet even in this bleak affair, a strange seed was planted. A young artisan, not repulsed by the display of power, was captivated, and he saw a union of supreme power and talent and a glorious new beginning. Days later he would approach the queen, his eyes alight with naive fervor, and pledge to craft for her a regalia of unparalleled magnificence, and Nasa would accept his sponsorship, seeing another useful passion to be exploited. And weeks would pass along the cycle of growth, and Nasa would lead a small procession with her consort, who walks a pace behind her like a shadow, and her speaker, Ondar. And they would travel towards the swamp-rotted hovels that housed the island's orphans. With her steward now installed, his days spent in a frantic effort to monetize every inch of Norg-Tzel and solidify and expand her domain, the queen would turn to the final piece of her new foundation: the future. A lich is eternal, but the vessel is not. An assassin's blade, a powerful rival spell, a poisoned chalice, or a buryment underneath a lot of rubble. If her body was destroyed, her spirit would require a new host to continue her great work. And she needed an heir, and of course she could not produce one in her own bloodline, but of her essence. And a dynasty founded not on parentage, but on relentless, calculated experimentation. And they would arrive at the orphanage. It would be a wretched place filled with the sounds of quiet misery, and the caretaker, of course, a stooped woman, would bow so low her head would touch the mud. And Nasa would move past the rows and rows of listless children, her gaze sweeping over them with the discerning eye of a master craftsman. And she was looking for a specific quality, not health or intelligence or beauty. She was looking for resilience and a spirit that had been bent but not broken. A soul tempered in the fires of suffering. For only such a vessel would be strong enough to one day contain her own vast and terrible consciousness. And the queen would eventually lock eyes with a small figure huddled in the dark corner, and a child the others would instinctively avoid. And his name was Hatchling. His scales were disfigured and one arm was twisted at an unnatural angle. He would flinch as the queen's shadow fell over him. "Ah!" screamed the caretaker. "Forgive him, great queen! This is only Hatchling. He is damaged, of no use, no use. He has long since accepted he will die in this place." And of course the consort's face will be bewildered. Why would she, the ultimate perfectionist, a pure pragmatist, choose the most broken child? And Ondar's expression would be of profound pain. He sees a suffering child about to be swept up into the queen's machinations. But where they saw weakness, Nasa saw potential, perfection. The boy's torment was a virtue, and his survival a testament to his great strength. And the thought of this broken creature being elevated, oh yes, of the shock and discomfort it would sow in her court, it was a source of exquisite amusement. And her interactions with him would be like a freezer burn, a touch so cold it seared, and a passion, interest veiled in icy detachment. And this would be her first personal experiment. And she would approach Hatchling and kneel, and act so out of character it would make her consort flinch. "They say you are broken. Do you believe that to be true?" I am. I am what I am, great queen. "You have endured. That is a rare quality. Ugliness can be a shield. pain can be a teacher. You've had a lifetime of both. You are not broken. You are tempered. And I have decided you are coming home with me. But why? I was never an option for anyone. Are you sure you didn't make a mistake? And then in that moment, she would reach out, not with a comforting hand, but with a single sharp claw. She would place it under the boy's chin, forcing his gaze to meet up with hers, and her touch would be as cold as the dirt. I do not make mistakes, and you will never call yourself broken again. It is an inaccurate assessment of your quality, and I will not have my property disparaging itself. Nasa would take the child, of course, and adopt him as her own and bring her in. She would lead hatchling into the court, and the effect would be immediate. Courtiers would stare, and their whispers dyeing their throats, and her consort would stand beside the throne, and in his face a storm of confusion and silent resentment. And Ondar would look from his altar, his eyes closed as if in prayer, and his heart heavy with certainty that this is a dark seed planted in the heart of the Ghost Hist. But so the serpent's nest was complete, and she had built and obtained a consort for her kingdom, a son to house her soul, acquired through fear and calculation. The White Queen had now built a foundation in a dynasty built not on love or lineage, but on ambition and the promise of growth. The nest was full, but it seethed. It seethed in. But of course, the stage for her ambition would collide with the harsh realities of the world. And the final act would be one of a temptation to a darker path. An avalanche, once started, does not tolerate obstacles, and Queen Nasa's will, unleashed, was an avalanche of progress, would scour Norg-Tzel clean of its path. And her consort, Stuart Kalcharan, would be put to work with the desperate energy of a man who knew his life depended on his results. Foundations for new structures were in the works. Canals would be dug to drain the swamps, and for the first time in centuries, the sound of organized labor would echo across the island. But progress is a hungry god, and each stone laid, each yard of earth moved, cost the queen dearly in wealth, and more importantly in prestige. And her vision was a fire that threatened to consume its own fuel before it could provide any warmth. And amidst this grand, frustrating struggle, the lesser ambitions of her court consumed their own orbits. The artisan who had been inspired at the queen's wedding had worked tirelessly on the regalia, but now he had come seeking an audience, and his creation incomplete, with his own ambition hitting a wall of its own. My great queen, the work proceeds, but to achieve the masterwork status your glory needs, I require more materials. The unmarked fangs of a mirewood, my budget is exhausted, and I need more funds to complete the regalia that you seek. You have what you have, artisan, and you will make do, and your vanity projects is not my priority. Do not bother me with this again. And of course, the artisan, crushed, would leave and retreat with his work, and weeks later he would present the piece. It was a fine creation, but not the legend it could have been, and it was due to the monument of limited resources and stifled potential. And Nasa, she accepted it with an indifferent glance and tossed it to her consort. An afterthought, a trinket, but the episode was another splinter under her claw, and an irritating reminder of the constraints that were chafing her grand design. And the true source of her rage was not artistic, but strategic. While her internal developments would crawl along, her ambition at expansion was limited. Through careful manipulation of the ancient rites, eventually her ghost speaker would produce a legal claim on the lands of a weak neighboring chieftain, for she needed to build more wealth to solidify the Black Marsh. But all this time, the thought of an easy victory had been a release valve for her pressure. But the day that finally came when she was ready to act, to unleash her army and be filled at the thrill of her expansions, she was very excited. The time for building is now over, and we will take and prepare the armies, and we will march. But, alas, the world would have its own claims, and the cost of fabricating the claim had been the final straw, lingering her away, and her previous acts of converting over to Vermina left a serious dent in her devotion, limiting her abilities to advance. And as she had to wait until she would be able to regain her strength, those supposed weak targets would form of defensive alliances, and to invite war and attack would put her in a precarious position, and she would be stuck in her island for a little while longer, entrapped by the realities of politics and economics. She would be stuck and incapable of even raiding, and would have to wait and develop. But as her avalanche fall would hit a mountain, she would sweep away from the war council and instead refocus onto the boy hatchling. She would teach him the ways of fighting with a wooden sword. He is clumsy, but there would be a dogged determination in his movements, and he would stop and freeze as the queen approaches. And her interactions with the boy was, again, the epitome of a freezer burn. And it would be a touch so cold, but it would sear with a strange predatory passion. And this was one of her grand projects, and it was her experiment in forming a long-line dynasty beyond the simple mechanics of blood. And he would be the first of a long line. Your stance is flawed, your grip is weak, and you fight like a whelp swatting at flies. Again. And Hatchling would reset his stance. Nasa would circle him. Her eyes, of course, they would miss nothing, and she was not a teacher, but a terrifying artisan examining her clay. I chose you because you have endured. Do not mistake endurance for strength. Endurance is passive, and strength is will applied, and you will learn to apply your will, or you will be a failed experiment, and I do not suffer failures. Now strike! And she was not raising a son. She was calibrating a weapon and testing a vessel for its tolerances. And every harsh word was a measurement, and every moment of fear she instilled was a test of the soul's tensile strength. And her passion was not love, but the intense obsessive focus of a master attempting to craft a living key, a successive vessel to fit and house her own should the need arise. And it was the most profound attention the boy had ever received, and it was utterly terrifying. But of course he was forever enamored, for no one, and not even he, would have thought that the queen of the island herself would choose him. And as her rage cooled by the development of her son Hatchling, it will be replaced by something more dangerous. Her desire for power would be left, and her desire for expansion would be failures. Everything was a fatal tool, unequal to the scale of her own vision. And then she would eventually eye on to the skull of corruption. It seemed to pulse with a faint light, whispering promises that have no need for gold or treaties. But she had tried to use its power before, but had unable to find its ways yet, limited by only those in the immediate vicinity. And now it just rested as a tool in her collection, just buffing her. But now in her ambitions, she saw a different kind of power, and would eventually plot her way to tear through the land itself. And of course, at the end, Endar would pass away, and the realm priest would go, along with all doubt of the Ghost Hist faith.